Good morning, everybody. Happy Wednesday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. So we've got a great friend of the show, Will Jawando, is on. In addition to the great insights he always provides on the Rising panel, he's also a Montgomery County City Council member.
Right.
And so he has some new data about how Maryland residents are doing paying their rent that we want to dig into. So that'll be interesting and not great signs there. Reed Wilson, who's a Hill reporter, who also happens to be an expert in pandemics, wrote a book about Ebola.
Literally wrote the book on it.
Yeah, is going to be here to talk about the Roosevelt-style public policies that health experts are advocating right now. So that'll be interesting as well. But in the midst of a pandemic, voters went to the polls yesterday.
Yes.
Insanity.
Mystifyingly, this has been such a cluster from the very beginning. And so let's review. So in the beginning, there was a standoff between the Wisconsin governor and the state legislature. The state legislature didn't want to move the election. The Wisconsin governor didn't want to take any action. 24 hours before the election yesterday, the governor says, okay, we're going to extend the election. I think he was going to extend balloting until June, yes, all absentee. That gets overruled by two courts, the state Supreme Court and the district court, federal court. And so then, well, the district court actually sides with the governor. So then it becomes a federal matter. You have two different. So then that goes to the Supreme Court, which splits 5-4 conservative liberal, with the majority ruling that the election, that they cannot materially change the terms of the election by extending the ballot through June. So then the election happens anyway, and the result is this. We have some video of a little bit of what the polls looked like yesterday in Wisconsin.
Well,
it's
because
terrible.
And part of why there were these massive long lines is because they closed many, an overwhelming majority of the polling places because they don't have poll workers, because people are like, are you crazy? Yeah. I'm not going out and working the polls in a pandemic. So look, voters are doing their best to space themselves out 6 feet apart. But I'll tell you, when I went to bed last night, and granted, I go to bed pretty early because we get up pretty early for the show, people were still in line to try to vote. Absolutely immoral, unconscionable choice that these voters are faced with. Either be disenfranchised or risk not only your health, but risk spreading further into your community this virus. It is unconscionable that public officials put voters into this spot. And the interesting thing from the media perspective, not a surprise here, is when it was Democrats who were saying, go ahead with Arizona, go ahead with Illinois, go ahead with Florida. DNC, you'll remember, threatened states that they may lose delegates if they moved their primaries past a certain date. When that was all going on, everybody was chill. Nobody really talked about it. Randy Weingarten, head of AFT, who's endorsed Joe Biden, said, get your hand sanitizer out and get out there. Joe himself said he essentially deferred to the conservative majority state court and Supreme Court in terms of what should happen here. And when that was going on, it was all fine. But the moment they could turn it into a Republicans are bad story, which there is blame here, no doubt about it. The moment they could turn it into that Republicans are to blame, suddenly there was outrage about it.
And that's what really bothered me about the whole thing. And look, people here know that I depart very strongly from the mainstream GOP whenever it comes to voting and the way that we do all this. And then all of a sudden, the moment the court rules on it, it becomes a Voting Rights Act. People are outraged. You weren't outraged whenever Biden was encouraging people to go to the polls in Florida, and elderly people got sick, which we covered right here on this show.
Poll workers in Florida got sick because they worked the polls. They got the virus because they worked the polls. And who knows how many others?
They didn't care. It's because the DNC was coronating Joe Biden. They wanted people to continue to go to the polls. And the moment that there was a Republican angle, then they could be like, oh, screw you. They want people to die, blah, blah, blah. And the lack of consistency is ultimately what leads to gridlock, which is there are only a few people, I think, who are legitimately consistent on them. One of them is not former Vice President Joe Biden, who in an interview yesterday said he just had a little bit of a gut feeling that people shouldn't be voting. Let's take a listen to that.
Do you think you won in Wisconsin tonight? Ordinarily, I'd be hitting you over the head with all these exit polls and crosstabs and things that I know about people all the way down to what they like for lunch. We're not going to have anything until Monday. What's your gut?
No, we're not. Well, my gut is that we shouldn't have had the election in the first place, the in-person election. It should have been all mail ballots in. It should have been moved in the way that 5 other states have done it. It's the idea didn't have enough poll workers in over 100 and some polling places in Milwaukee. But this was all about Republican legislature pushing really, really hard to maintain and make sure they had an election because I think they know that low turnout affects their interest.
Ah, okay.
Oh, really?
So now it's the Republicans' fault. He had a gut feeling, blah, blah, blah. Well, I think we know that gut feeling answer is complete BS because we played here this clip that we're about to play for you a couple of days ago with a little bit of a different tune.
Hi, Mr. Vice President. So my question is about the Wisconsin primary and whether you think it's still appropriate to have in-person voting there, considering the fact that the Democratic National Convention has been pushed back and public health officials say it's important to stay home at this time.
Well, the answer is I listened to the scientists. A convention having tens of thousands of people in one arena is very different than having people walk into a polling booth with accurate spacing to 6 to 10 feet apart, one at a time going in and have machines scrubbed down. But I do think there are going to be a lot more. I think you could hold the election as well, dealing with mail-in ballots and same-day registration. I mean, there's a lot of things that can be done. That's for the Wisconsin courts and folks to decide. But I think it's possible to do both, to have both more mail-in ballots. People, and today is the last day, I guess, till 5 o'clock to ask for one. It was an hour time difference from where I am in Wisconsin. And I think it could be done based on what I've been hearing from the news and what I understand the governor and others are saying. But that's for them to decide.
Oh, there's the gut feeling. It's right there.
Convention is totally different, and we'll leave it up to the Wisconsin court, but I think it'll be fine. I think they can do it, Saagar, no problem. I mean, it's just so blatant. Like, it is so incredibly blatant. Democrats and Democratic establishment, including Joe Biden, including Simone Sanders, including Tom Perez and the DNC, wanted these primaries to go forward as quickly as possible until they were sure that Joe had a lock on the nomination. Political convenience. That's all it is. And then the moment that they can turn it into a Republicans are bad story because it's a conservative majority court in Wisconsin and a conservative majority Supreme Court that rules to hold the election, then they wipe their hands of it. Oh, I never thought voters should go to the polls. I had a gut feeling that this was the wrong thing to do. You don't need a gut feeling. We're in the midst of a pandemic. Every health expert that you could possibly talk to would say that this is insanity and would have said that a week ago, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, a month ago. They would have told you this.
Yeah, and that's what really bothers me about, like I said, I mean, you see the blatant hypocrisy. We just rolled the tape. How many cable segments on this are going to just talk about the court, and then they're going to play that thing?
100%.
They're going to only talk about the court. They're going to say Biden had a gut feeling that, he's like, oh, I think it's unconscionable, the majority, this is why I need to win the presidency so I can appoint justices that would have ruled differently. And it's like, you still, when the chips were down, you put your voters, and by the way, whose base is elderly. And actually, we're seeing elderly African Americans have some of the highest mortality rates in places like Michigan. And there's a reason for that, because of the systemic problems in our healthcare system. And yet, there we go. Who are these people that support Joe Biden? And he is encouraging them with misinformation to go vote. Over a month ago, over a long period, there was never a reckoning with this at the time. And that's why when you see it, it's blatant hypocrisy. And this is the whole thing with Biden, is he tries to claim moral high ground after moral high ground after moral high ground, but is a cynical political actor when it matters. And again, I respect some cynicism, actually, in terms of playing the game. Not in this particular case, because I think it's morally reprehensible, but he denies being that cynical political actor. He denies being the guy who raised his hand during the debate when asked whether he would raise his hand, saying he wouldn't necessarily support the person with the majority of the plurality of the delegates going into the convention, and then claims moral high ground whenever he's on top, saying, oh, we don't need any more debates. This is an election. We're going to cover more of what he's doing with Bernie Sanders later in the show. But over and over and over again, he tries to claim this high ground, but really it's just pure power politics. And you have to choose one. That's why I respect Sanders in this case. He said to his voters, don't vote. It's not safe. I respect that.
Not doing GOTV. Absolutely. And by the way, I still haven't forgotten the way that the Democratic establishment, remember in Iowa, when it was so close. And they started the last caucuses that they counted were those satellite caucuses, which were overwhelmingly working class, a lot of immigrants, a lot of minorities, and they were going overwhelmingly for Bernie Sanders. And the whole thing had been a mess, right? I'm sure everybody remembers what an absolute disaster. You get partial results. They are wrong. The app breaks, all of that. Tom Perez doesn't say a word until those satellite caucuses, again, overwhelmingly minority, working class caucuses, a group that the Democrats are supposed to care about. When those start to come in, that's when he says, whoa. We got to hold the phones. We got to have a recount here as Bernie Sanders starts to close the gap, right? And that tells you everything you need to know about their real principles and their real values. And I think a real question that I've been thinking about and pondering that I put out to Twitter last night is like, look, Republicans and the Democratic establishment here were completely immoral actors, willing to literally risk voters' lives for their own power. That is, I mean, that's what we saw. That's what we saw not just in Wisconsin, but in Florida, Arizona, Illinois. They were willing to risk voters' lives in order to gain power. How, as a movement that is trying to be a moral movement, do you compete with that immorality? You know, if they're always willing to go further, we kind of saw this with the bailout package too. Remember, Lindsey Graham came out and they were willing to blow the whole thing up because poor people might get a little bit more money on unemployment. They're always willing to go harder than, you know, those who are trying to be moral and actually trying to do good things in the country. And to me, that's one of the more dispiriting elements of this is I just don't know how you compete with that.
Well, I'm going to go a little bit into it yesterday, which is, frankly, you have to play the game. You have to actually know how power works, and you have to make sure that you preempt these types of things because they have power structures. They have the things built into place so that they can enable that. And what you do is you take power in another instance, you shape institutions so that you don't have situations like this. But look, that's not a satisfying answer. It's a long shot, especially when you're coming from the outside, and it takes a long time to do. And in the meantime, the only good thing, the only solace is that the majority of people saw what happened yesterday and said, this is a disgrace.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's the only answer is being willing to explicitly weaponize your movement to hold power to account so that immorality doesn't go unchecked. I think that's really ultimately the only answer here.
That really is the only answer. That's politics.
That is politics. We're going to tell you what's on our radars. That's next.